In the dim glow of lantern light, her silhouette moved like poetry. But she wasn't a dancer. She wasn't free. She was a woman owned, displayed, and priced, yet more powerful than most wives in the city. This was not a love story. This was survival behind the silk screens of the ancient brothel. Long before modern medicine, long before the invention of condoms or family planning, there existed an underground world ruled not by kings, but by courtesans. In this hidden world, elegance was currency, wit was weaponry, and silence could mean the difference between life and death. In the heart of the ancient capital, where incense burned in temples and coins clinked in market stalls, stood a structure unlike any other, the House of Fragrant Shadows. It looked almost holy from the outside, curved rooftops like temple wings, carved doors adorned with phoenixes and lotuses. But once inside, it was a different realm entirely. The air was thick with perfume, secrets, and the unspoken power of women who had no choice but to master the art of survival. They were not simply prostitutes, they were entertainers, poets, musicians, and in many cases, brilliant strategists. The most respected of them weren't judged by how many men they could seduce, but by how many they could refuse without losing favor. Each woman came with a story, some sold by poor families, others abducted during raids, and a few born into the trade. For many, the brothel was the end of freedom. For others, strangely, it was the beginning. The rules of the house. The moment a girl entered the brothel, she was renamed, her past erased, her identity crafted like a painting. She'd learn to walk with slow grace, speak in riddles, pour tea with a flick of the wrist so delicate it could make a soldier weep. Everything was calculated. How she laughed, when she blinked, how long she held eye contact. At first, she wouldn't see clients. She'd observe, practice the pipa, a traditional lute, learn poetry, recite lines from famous court dramas. For months, even years, she was groomed like an imperial flower, not for beauty, but for intellectual seduction. But behind this elegance lay a brutal truth. If she became pregnant, she could be cast out, beaten, or worse. And so, even in the ancient world, contraception wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. But that part of the story comes later. First, you need to understand the system. The four ranks of the brothel. Not all women were treated equally. The house was divided into ranks. The blossoms, young trainees still being groomed, unseen by clients. The song mistresses, mid-tier entertainers allowed to sing or perform, but not yet sleep with patrons. The silk courtesans, the highest-ranking women able to choose their clients and often advise nobility. The house matron, a former courtesan herself, often cruel, sometimes kind, but always in control. The silk courtesans held the most influence. Some were rumored to be the secret lovers of generals, judges, even scholars who shaped policy. In private, they discussed philosophy. In public, they performed coyness, like a master violinist plays a sad tune, perfectly, every time. Freedom, sold in pieces. Contrary to romanticized myths, most of these women were not waiting for a man to save them. Redemption was rare. Contracts could be bought, but at steep prices. Sometimes, a wealthy client would fall in love and pay the brothel to release a courtesan. But more often, men made promises and disappeared. The smarter courtesans knew freedom had to be earned, not given. Many saved every coin, not for escape, but to bribe guards, buy medicine, or protect younger girls from being sold into darker places. And always, in the back of their minds, was the unrelenting fear. What if I get pregnant? What then? That fear, and the ingenuity it forced, is where this story turns darker and more fascinating. But before we descend into those secrets, let us pause here. At the edge of incense and silk, where beauty was both a shield and a trap, he said he loved her, said he would come back, said she didn't need to worry. But the only thing he left behind was a child she could never keep. In the polished world of ancient courtesans, desire was carefully measured, like pouring tea without spilling a drop. Yet no amount of grace could change one inescapable truth. Men could leave, women could not. Inside the brothel, men came and went like the wind, some gentle, some cruel. Some so in love, they offered gifts, poems, and even promises of marriage. But whether they brought roses or rage, they all shared one luxury the courtesans never had: freedom. When a man left the brothel, he returned to his life untouched. If he fathered a child with a courtesan, he bore no shame, no burden. But the woman, her life was over. Pregnancy, a forbidden crime. In brothels across ancient Asia, from Tang Dynasty China to Edo period Japan, pregnancy was not only frowned upon, it was seen as a betrayal. Why? Because every courtesan was an investment. Her body, her training, even her emotions, all belonged to the house. If she became pregnant, she was considered damaged, unable to perform, and worst of all, a liability. Some houses forced immediate abortion. Others sold pregnant women to lower-end dens, where survival rates were grim. A few allowed the child to be taken away, sold or abandoned, with no record of its parentage. But in most cases, the girl bore the punishment alone. The secret arts of birth control. It's here, in this shadowed space between survival and punishment, that history reveals something astonishing. Ancient courtesans practiced remarkably advanced methods of contraception, far earlier than most assume. Passed down quietly from elder to apprentice, these methods were never taught in books. They were shared in whispers, practiced in secret, and perfected through generations. Let's uncover what they did. Herbal contraceptives. Among the most common tools were bitter herbal infusions, mixtures of plants and roots believed to prevent pregnancy. Some of the most used included wild carrot seed, Queen Anne's lace, taken as a postcoital tea, believed to block implantation; cotton root bark, boiled and consumed to disrupt hormonal balance; blue cohosh and pennyroyal, known for menstrual stimulation, though often toxic; silphium, now extinct, but once a prized contraceptive in the ancient Mediterranean, traded as far as Asia. The courtesans would prepare these teas after intimate sessions, often with great care, balancing dosage with secrecy. Too strong, and they risked poisoning. Too weak, and they risked pregnancy. They walked a tightrope every single day. Intravaginal barriers. Some high-ranking women used handmade devices, soft sea sponges soaked in vinegar or wine, inserted before intercourse to create a chemical and physical barrier. Others used beeswax-coated cloths, papaya root mixtures applied internally, or rare, imported olive oil-soaked cotton, mimicking the ancient Greek methods. These items were expensive and not always available to lower-ranking workers. But in elite brothels with access to trade routes, they were part of a courtesan's hidden arsenal. Abstinence. By strategy, the most skilled courtesans avoided intercourse altogether, not through refusal, but through distraction. They would convince clients they were in mourning or observing sacred rituals, use elaborate erotic storytelling and non-penetrative techniques to satisfy men without actual intercourse, feign illness or injury, or simply schedule their sessions to align with what they understood as their safe days. This natural cycle tracking, though rudimentary, was surprisingly effective for some. They counted days, observed physical changes, and trusted the oral wisdom passed down by older sisters. Accidents that weren't accidents. If all else failed and a pregnancy occurred, there was one final chilling method: herbs that induced miscarriage. These were used quietly and dangerously with mixtures of mugwort, dongquai, tansy, or even mercury-based compounds. Some women survived the process. Others died from bleeding or infection. In rare cases, the child was born anyway, but taken at birth and sold into slavery. The truth was brutal. To carry a child was to carry a death sentence, either for the baby or for the woman. A man's fantasy, a woman's nightmare. And yet, the men who visited brothels often romanticized their relationships with courtesans. They wrote poems. Your skin is the moon. Your eyes, a quiet rebellion. Let me make you mine, forever. But they never stayed. Even when love was real, and sometimes it was, society wouldn't allow a courtesan to marry a scholar or warrior. No respectable family would accept her. No temple would bless their union. Her value was in her distance. So she learned not to love. She learned to survive. And sometimes, when she did love, she took more herbs than usual the next day, just in case. Behind the silken curtains and layers of makeup, courtesans in ancient times were not just women of beauty. They were tacticians. One of their most important and closely guarded skills was avoiding pregnancy. Unlike common wives whose primary role was to bear children, courtesans had to maintain their figure, appearance, and freedom from motherhood in order to preserve their value and continue working. Pregnancy was not only seen as a risk to their livelihood, but also a threat to the power structures of the elite. So how did they manage this in a time with no modern contraceptives? Herbal knowledge passed down in secret. Midwives, older courtesans, and traditional healers passed down knowledge of herbal contraceptives through quiet rituals and coded language. Women in the brothels often brewed teas or tinctures made from natural ingredients known to interfere with conception. One popular herb was a root soaked in hot water and consumed after intercourse. Others included bitter seeds and bark infusions. These were not foolproof, but they were often all a woman had. Certain bitter herbs were even mixed into wine and drunk daily, much like modern birth control pills. More advanced courtesans would time their intake based on lunar cycles, believing that conception was more likely during certain moon phases. Whether or not this was biologically sound, it shows a remarkable effort to track fertility centuries before ovulation kits or medical science. Withdrawal and controlled intercourse. Older courtesans trained younger women in how to direct their clients, even during intimate moments. Some practiced techniques of withdrawal, convincing clients to finish outside the body, or simply used positions believed to reduce the chances of conception. In some brothels, the madams even paid attention to when a client had already fathered too many children or had a reputation for impregnating women. and would assign him to older or retired women who were no longer fertile. Use of animal membranes. One of the lesser known and more surprising techniques was the use of animal membranes or thin silk as early forms of barrier contraception. These were tied around the male organ to prevent semen from entering the body. Though primitive, they were surprisingly effective and served as a precursor to modern condoms. In higher class brothels, silk soaked in herbal mixtures was used as a vaginal insert, acting both as a barrier and a spermicide. These silk pieces were often custom embroidered or perfumed, turning something functional into an art of seduction. Sacred abstinence and ritual cleanliness. Some women avoided pregnancy by declaring temporary spiritual vows, claiming a need for purification or penance during certain festivals or religious cycles. This allowed them to avoid sex entirely for a few days or even weeks, under the guise of piety. Some clients respected these rituals, seeing them as signs of a woman's inner strength and spiritual power. It was a clever way to assert control over their bodies without outright refusal, which could be dangerous in a world where women's choices were often ignored. Dangerous methods, the risks they took. Not all methods were safe. Some women, desperate not to get pregnant, would consume toxic substances believed to prevent or end early pregnancy. Certain poisons or extremely bitter herbs could cause severe cramping or bleeding. These were dangerous and sometimes fatal. Stories were passed around in whispers about girls who drank too much of the wrong thing and never woke up. There were even cases where wealthy clients demanded proof that a courtesan was clean or had no children. These expectations pushed some women into harmful self-treatment. Yet despite the dangers, they persisted, because the alternative was worse: losing their place, their earnings, or being cast out if found to be pregnant. The economics of a body. Why pregnancy was a death sentence. Being pregnant in a brothel, or even suspected of it, was almost always the end of a courtesan's career. Unlike noble women, they weren't protected by marriage or wealth. No one would raise their child. No one would feed a mother unable to work for months. There were no maternity leaves. The entire system relied on the illusion of eternal youth and availability. Some brothels had strict rules. If a girl missed her cycle 2 months in a row, she would be tested by older women or the madam herself. If confirmed pregnant, she might be sold off to rural labor, married off to an old man as compensation, or quietly disposed of through abandonment or worse. This brutal economic pressure made contraception not just a personal choice, but a survival strategy. While their lives were shaped by external forces, patriarchy, poverty, and social stigma, courtesans were far from passive victims. Many became masters of subtle resistance, using wit, knowledge, and emotional intelligence to survive and thrive. In the matter of reproduction, this resistance was especially strong. The less they depended on men, the more power they retained over their own fate. Building alliances with herbalists and midwives. Courtesans rarely operated alone. The most successful ones built networks, quiet webs of female support that extended from the brothel house into the alleys, markets, and temples. Midwives and herbalists, often women cast aside by society, were valuable allies. These women provided access to contraceptive herbs, miscarriage-inducing remedies, or fertility blockers passed down for generations. Some brothels paid these women in food, shelter, or protection in exchange for their services. In certain elite districts, the courtesans kept private herbal gardens with carefully grown plants that aided both beauty and birth control. Intellectual autonomy as protection. In higher tier establishments, courtesans were not only judged by beauty, but by intellect. Some were trained to read, write poetry, recite philosophy, and understand legal documents. This gave them tools to subtly challenge male dominance. An educated courtesan could manipulate contracts, interpret client moods, and negotiate her own fees, essentially controlling who touched her and when. These skills allowed some women to use flattery or distraction to avoid sex altogether. A clever poem or philosophical argument could keep a drunk client amused long enough to pass the night without intimacy. This was not just performance, it was calculated preservation. Seduction as strategy. Many women learned how to direct male desire without surrendering to it. They studied which clients preferred conversation over touch, who responded to jealousy games, or who could be led into financial traps without demanding physical payment. In these cases, seduction was used like currency, not unlike stock or trade. By keeping a client emotionally dependent but physically distant, some women could survive for months, sometimes years, without risking pregnancy at all. Temporary lovers and patron arrangements. Courtesans with charm and strategy could form what was known as a protection contract with a single man, a patron. He would pay her living expenses, offer gifts, and demand exclusivity in exchange for her withdrawal from the brothel. Though risky, these arrangements offered respite from the chaos of multiple partners and greater control over reproductive risk. Some clever courtesans negotiated terms that allowed them to refuse sex during certain times of the month, again, using their knowledge of their own bodies as a bargaining chip. Others lied, citing spiritual illness, needing rituals, or inventing taboos based on astrology. The role of age and experience. As they aged, many courtesans gained power rather than lost it. The older women, those who had survived without children, were seen as wise protectors. They often became madams or advisors, mentoring younger women in the arts of seduction, contraception, and mental survival. These veterans held secrets no man could access. They knew which girls were pregnant before anyone else did. They decided whether to cover for her or expose her. They enforced discipline, but also offered shelter. In a world stacked against women, the brothel hierarchy was one of the few systems where older women held real authority. Despite all efforts, pregnancies still occurred. And when they did, the aftermath was often tragic or heroic. Secret terminations. Abortions in the ancient world were incredibly dangerous. They were done in silence, often by trusted midwives under candlelight. Methods included herbal poisoning, abdominal massage, or inserting rough objects to induce miscarriage. Many women died during the process, but for some, there was no choice. To carry a child meant ruin. Some girls never told anyone. They hid their swelling under loose robes, consumed appetite suppressants, and continued working until it was too late. Others turned to senior courtesans for help. In a few stories, wealthy clients arranged for private care and ensured the baby would be taken to the countryside to be raised by a servant. Children raised in shadows. It was not unheard of for a courtesan to secretly give birth and return to work within weeks. The child might be hidden in another province, raised by her own mother, or given to the temple as an orphan. The heartbreak of separation was real, but so was the necessity. Only a rare few, those who earned a client's love and protection, kept their children close. These children were sometimes given education and a chance at a life beyond the brothel. But more often, their mothers never saw them again. Women who left the trade for motherhood. There were also stories of women who chose to leave. Some used savings to escape with their unborn child, vanishing into the countryside to live as seamstresses, herbalists, or servants. These were the rare success stories often remembered in legend. One such woman, famous in folk songs, faked her own death and later became a midwife in a mountain village, helping other women avoid the fate she once endured. But most were not so lucky. Pregnancy was a gamble. Sometimes it meant protection. Other times, it was a sentence. Either way, courtesans never stopped finding ways to survive it. In the elite brothels of ancient Eastern empires, beauty was just the beginning. A successful courtesan had to master a delicate and dangerous game. Seduction, not only of the body, but of the mind. These women were trained in psychology long before the term existed. They studied male behavior, learned to read the moods of their clients, and used subtle cues, eye contact, silence, hesitation, compliments, to draw men deeper into their web. Each interaction was strategic. A courtesan would not immediately offer her company. Instead, she might engage a man in poetry, music, or a philosophical debate. The goal was not to please, but to haunt, to create a feeling of longing that would make the client return again and again, spending fortunes just for her attention. The women who mastered this became legends, often remembered more vividly than the men who paid for their time. But this power was fragile. If a woman became too beloved by one client, she risked being bought and locked away in private quarters, where her freedom and income would vanish. So, the most successful courtesans learned to maintain emotional distance, feigning affection while remaining unattached. Some even faked jealousy or sadness to deepen the illusion, making the man feel important, needed, irreplaceable. These emotional tactics were essential for survival. In a world where a single word could ruin reputations or cost lives, knowing how to play the game was not just a skill, it was protection. Despite what many believe, ancient brothel women were not passive victims of fate. In fact, they took deliberate and sometimes drastic measures to control their bodies and destinies, including methods of contraception. There was no such thing as modern birth control, of course, but midwives, herbalists, and older women passed down secret knowledge about how to avoid pregnancy. Women used herbal brews made from wild yam, silphium, or lotus seeds. Some of these concoctions were taken as teas, others were made into pastes and applied internally before or after intercourse. One of the most common methods was inserting cotton or silk soaked in wine, vinegar, or herbal infusions to create a barrier. Though primitive by today's standards, these techniques were considered remarkably effective at the time. Women would also track their menstrual cycles by using moon phases, knowing which nights to avoid clients or use extra precautions. The motivation wasn't just about health. It was survival. A pregnancy could mean banishment from the brothel, as a pregnant courtesan was considered spoiled goods. Worse, If a powerful man suspected the child was his, he might force her into silence or even death to protect his status. In rare cases, some high-ranking clients would take the child as their own. But for the mother, this often meant losing control over her life and becoming a concubine or servant in the man's house. So contraception was not simply a tool for freedom. It was a line between power and powerlessness, between safety and danger. In the brothel's dim corridors, another power structure existed, not among the clients, but between the women themselves. Despite the competition, courtesans formed secret alliances, guided by unspoken rules and silent gestures. These bonds were vital. When a client became violent, it was the other women who would hide the bruises or alert the madam. When one woman began to fall in love with a dangerous man, her sisters would intervene, sometimes gently, sometimes harshly, to protect her. They shared knowledge. Which clients were generous? Which ones lied? Who had diseases? Who brought gifts? In some houses, older women were assigned to mentor the younger ones, teaching them not just how to move or speak, but how to survive. And then there were the codes, tapping on walls to signal trouble, leaving a specific flower outside a room to indicate distress, using a particular phrase during performances to signal they were in danger. These quiet systems saved lives. Occasionally, friendships turned into rivalries, and betrayals could cut deeper than a sword. But more often, the women found strength in each other. For many, the brothel was the first place they had experienced anything close to sisterhood. Not all men who visited the brothels were the same. Most were minor officials, merchants, or soldiers. But sometimes, power walked in. A royal prince, a general, or even a high court advisor. These visits changed everything. When a man of such rank chose a courtesan, it was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it elevated her status. She might receive gold, jewelry, and protection. On the other, it placed her in political crossfire. Every word she said could be reported, twisted, or used against her. She could become a target of spies, wives, or rivals. Some women used this opportunity to their advantage. They extracted secrets, passed information to rival factions, or even influenced major political decisions through pillow talk. But the line between manipulation and danger was razor thin. There are recorded instances of courtesans who became mistresses of ministers, mothers of illegitimate heirs, or even spies for foreign powers. These stories often ended in tragedy, poisonings, forced suicides, disappearances. But for a fleeting moment, they held real influence in a male-dominated world. In a world where a single glance could command a fortune, beauty was a double-edged sword. The most admired courtesans lived in luxury, but they also became targets of envy, obsession, and vengeance. Inside the palace-like brothels, danger did not always come from men. It came from within. It wasn't uncommon for jealous rivals to slip poison into cosmetics, perfumes, or tea. The most coveted women were always wary, never drinking from cups poured by others, refusing gifts without inspection, avoiding shared brushes or combs. The brothel madams, aware of this shadow war, employed tasters or secretly marked safe items with invisible herbal dyes known only to their most trusted girls. But poison wasn't the only weapon. rumors could destroy a career just as effectively. A whisper that a courtesan had fallen ill, was disloyal, or carried a curse could be enough to exile her. Clients vanished. Coin stopped flowing. And sometimes the punishment was physical. Hair cut off in disgrace, faces scarred with hot metal, even limbs broken by jealous competitors in dark corners. Betrayal could come from lovers too. A client who felt too attached might punish the woman for making him weak. Some abducted courtesans and locked them away, convinced they were saving them from corruption. Others turned violent when rejected, unable to handle the humiliation. And then there were the women who betrayed themselves, who gave their hearts to a client despite every warning, only to be discarded once their novelty wore off. Some never recovered, some vanished. A few climbed out of despair and rebuilt themselves with harder smiles and colder hearts. In the brothel, beauty was power, but it was also a liability that had to be guarded every hour of every day. Some women never escaped, not because they died, but because they were forgotten. Once a courtesan aged, fell ill, or suffered an injury that diminished her market value, her options narrowed. Some were quietly retired and forced to serve as cleaners, laundry workers, or errand girls within the house they once ruled. Others were sent away, abandoned in remote temples or taken in by poorer relatives, ashamed to speak of the life they'd once lived in silks and candlelight. These forgotten women became ghosts long before they died, but in rare cases, they transformed into something else. Madams. The brothel madam was the ultimate survivor. She had seen everything: betrayals, riches, deaths, miracles. She knew every client's secret and every girl's lie. She ruled with a mixture of cruelty and care, protecting her girls with one hand while punishing them with the other. A few of these madams were feared even by noblemen. It was whispered that they kept books filled with secrets: who slept with who confessed what, who fathered which illegitimate child. Some of them used this knowledge to buy protection from local officials, or to blackmail their way into quiet wealth. But many madams were not monsters. They had simply lived long enough to know the cost of kindness. Some secretly saved money to help a favorite girl escape. Others lit incense for lost souls, or prayed each night that their past sins might be forgotten. And in the silence of their rooms, they sometimes wept for the lovers who never returned, the friends who disappeared, and the parts of themselves that no longer existed. Not all stories ended in sorrow. A few women, very few, escaped the brothel world and remade their lives. Some married wealthy clients who fell genuinely in love with them, though this was rare and often came with restrictions. These women were typically forced to sever all ties with their past, pretend they had never existed before marriage, and live in quiet seclusion. Others faked their own deaths, disappearing with the help of sympathetic guards, merchants, or even rival madams. They moved to distant villages, cut their hair, changed their names, and took up new identities as widows, healers, or seamstresses. And a bold handful reinvented themselves entirely. They traveled to foreign cities, opened their own establishments, became storytellers or entertainers, or even taught younger women how to survive without selling their bodies. In some cases, they became legends. Names passed down through whispered stories as proof that survival was possible, even in the darkest corners of society. But such reinvention came at a cost. They had to kill off the name and persona they had carefully crafted. The seductress became the quiet shopkeeper. The queen of silk rooms became a faceless figure in the market. They gave up luxury for safety, influence for anonymity. Yet, for them, the trade was worth it. Because the price of power in the brothel was often a piece of the soul. And to step away, truly away, was the most radical act of all. While the women of the brothels were trained to control their emotions, the same could not always be said for the men who visited them. Some came seeking relief. Others came for power, for the illusion that they could own beauty, control affection, or silence loneliness with silver. But the most dangerous were those who fell in love. These men blurred the line between transaction and obsession. They returned night after night, spending beyond their means, offering gifts, poetry, even land titles, convinced their chosen courtesan felt the same. They begged to be exclusive clients, demanded fidelity, or offered marriage, thinking their love would transform the relationship into something pure. But love in such a place was never clean. The courtesans were taught to simulate desire, to mirror their clients' hopes, to listen with tears in their eyes, and respond with softness that felt authentic. For some women, the act became so seamless that even they no longer knew where performance ended and feeling began. For the men, the illusion could become a prison. Some abandoned families and careers. Others killed for jealousy. In rare but tragic cases, they committed suicide in the courtesan's chambers, believing death would bind them together in eternity. The brothels knew how to handle such dangers. Madams had men forcibly removed, paid off grieving widows, or altered death scenes to protect the establishment's reputation. The courtesans were taught not to mourn, but to move on, to smile for the next client even as the scent of grief still clung to their robes. But among themselves, behind locked doors, they sometimes lit incense and whispered a name into the night, part prayer, part guilt, part farewell. Because, though they never asked for love, it always came. And when it did, it often shattered more than it saved. Though the brothel world was steeped in sensuality and survival, many of the women kept deeply spiritual lives, quiet, personal, often hidden from both clients and madams. Some prayed every morning before putting on their makeup, whispering pleas to Guan Yin or the Jade Emperor for protection. Others wore talismans sewn into their underclothes, given to them by mothers or grandmothers long ago. Each brothel had its own unofficial rituals. Before a new girl accepted her first client, elder courtesans sometimes bathed her in herbs and oils said to ward off evil. Before major festivals, they made secret offerings, cakes, incense, or coins, to the gods of fortune, love, and safe passage. Moon festivals were particularly emotional. On those nights, some women cried silently on the rooftops, watching the full moon and imagining the families they left behind. Others wrote letters they would never send, burned them, and let the smoke carry their longing to whatever heaven might listen. And when a courtesan died, her closest sisters performed quiet rites. Even if no temple would accept her body, they offered paper clothing, whispered prayers, and folded her favorite silk robe neatly under her head. It was a way to say, "You were here, you mattered, you are not forgotten." These sacred acts didn't erase the pain or the injustice. But they reminded the women that they still had something untouched by the market, a thread of faith, a sliver of self, something eternal. In a world that bought and sold everything, their spirituality was the one thing that remained unpriced. When an emperor or crown prince visited a brothel, either in disguise or in full regalia, the house changed overnight. Silks were replaced, lanterns polished, perfumes imported. The most beautiful women were dressed like empresses and trained not only in pleasure, but in poetry, politics, and perfect silence. Every breath was measured, every glance choreographed, because a single misstep could result in a girl being exiled or executed. For some courtesans, such visits were the peak of their careers. If they pleased the emperor, they might be summoned to the palace and granted favors, jewels, or even political influence. A few even became imperial concubines, though this path was treacherous and paved with enemies. But others dreaded the emperor's presence, for his attention was absolute, and his whims were law. If he desired a girl, she had no choice. If he grew bored, she could vanish without explanation. And if she angered him, her punishment could be made into an example for the rest. The mesdames knew this. They drilled their best girls for days. Some bribed imperial guards to know the emperor's mood in advance. Others offered rare performances, girls who played the Guqin blindfolded, or recited poetry while dancing on knives, hoping to impress. Yet even in these high-stakes encounters, some women found quiet rebellion. A whispered line in a poem that hinted at sadness, a look held too long, a tear that wasn't part of the act. And sometimes, those small acts were remembered, not by the emperor, but by other women, who saw the courage it took to remain human in the presence of a man treated like a god. Not all courtesans bore children, but those who did carried an invisible grief with them every day. Pregnancy was dangerous in the brothel world. Many madams forced their girls to take herbal concoctions that induced miscarriage. Children were seen as a liability, something that softened a courtesan's edge, distracted her from clients, or complicated her market value. In the rare cases when a child was allowed to be born, it was usually taken away immediately. Some children were given to orphanages or sold to foster families. Others were secretly raised by elderly servants or hidden relatives. A few courtesans paid dearly, sacrificing their earnings for years to ensure their child received an education, a trade, a chance at a different life. But it came at a cost. These mothers lived in silence, pretending they had no child. They smiled for their clients, danced through moonlit nights, and returned to their rooms to stare at tiny shoes tucked in drawers, or to read the same fading letter over and over again. Some were lucky enough to receive visits, a boy who came once a year posing as a courier, or a girl who brought pastries on her birthday, calling the courtesan auntie instead of mother. Others were not so lucky. They waited and waited until the waiting became a kind of dying. And then there were those who never knew what happened to the child they gave up. They only dreamed of them, year after year, imagining a face, a name, a life, hoping they were loved, praying they were safe. The brothel never mentioned these children. No client asked, no madam cared. But among the women, late at night, the truth sometimes emerged. She had a son, they would whisper. He looked just like her. They took him away when he was 2. And in that whisper lived an entire universe of love denied, motherhood hidden, and longing buried under layers of silk and rouge. Leaving a brothel was not as simple as walking out the door. Some women were contract bound, their debts calculated in cruel increments, costs for food, training, makeup, and clothes. Others were emotionally trapped, with no family to return to and no respectable work available. Society had little mercy for a former courtesan. She could not be a wife to a good man. She could not teach, serve, or pray in a temple. She was stained, and everyone knew it, yet some women still tried. A few escaped, cutting their hair, stealing coins, boarding riverboats at night. Others were redeemed by wealthy clients who paid off their debt and offered marriage or protection. But even those so-called saviors could be fickle. Some abandoned the women after a few months. Others treated them like property, not partners. Still, a rare few succeeded. They opened tea houses or started sewing shops. They took new names, told new stories. Some lived in villages where no one knew their past, and for the first time in years, they breathed without fear. But they never truly forgot. They remembered the girls who couldn't escape, the ones who died in silk robes, still smiling. They remembered the songs, the secrets, the things they had to do to survive. And sometimes, on cold nights, they lit a single stick of incense, not for the gods, but for the women they once were. Because leaving didn't mean healing. It just meant starting over, with scars the world couldn't see. Centuries later, the brothels are gone. The houses of pleasure, once lit by lanterns and laughter, now stand in ruin, or have been replaced by modern buildings that remember nothing. But the women are not entirely forgotten. Some have been immortalized in poetry, though often by the very men who once owned their stories. Others appear in paintings, barefoot, sorrowful, draped in longing. A few are honored in folk tales, their names changed, their tragedies romanticized. Yet the truth remains buried under layers of myth. They were not just muses or symbols of lost beauty. They were real, clever, cunning, courageous, trapped and resilient, laughing and weeping in equal measure. They lived in a world that traded their bodies but never fully broke their minds. In modern times, historians have begun to uncover their letters, their diaries, their contracts, and through these fragments, a fuller picture emerges, not just of exploitation, but of agency, not just of sorrow, but of sisterhood. Museums now display their hairpins and embroidered slippers. Academics debate the ethics of their survival. Artists recreate their dances. Activists name shelters and scholarships in their memory. But more than anything, they live on in the quiet recognition that somewhere, some part of womanhood has always resisted, even in the darkest rooms, under the heaviest silence. They were not just women of the brothels. They were women of history. It was found folded tightly inside a bamboo flute, sealed with a thread of silk and time. When scholars opened it, the ink had faded, but the words remained. A letter never sent. A voice never silenced. It began simply, "If you are reading this, I am likely already gone. Not to death, perhaps, but to the place where no one remembers your name, not the name they gave you, not the name you chose." She called herself Mei Lin, though she admitted it was not her birth name. She had entered the brothel at 15, sold for 3 silver coins, and a promise that she'd eat rice every day. She became popular quickly, too quickly. Beauty and wit, she wrote, were double-edged swords. They won favors, but also bred jealousy. In the letter, she spoke not of men or their hands, but of silence. Silence is what kills you here. Not the laughter, not the eyes, not even the nights. It is the silence of your own soul, retreating further into the back of your mind. She wrote of another girl, Yunhua, her only friend. She once dreamt of becoming a midwife. I told her she still could. She said, I cannot touch other women's pain when I'm drowning in my own. She bled too much one winter and never woke up. Maylin's words were raw, unpolished, honest. She wrote about how the madam would change the hourglass by a few grains to extend a client's time. How the makeup girl secretly gave her bruises, salve passed down by her grandmother. How the boy who brought in coal each night once asked her what stars looked like from the inside. And then in the last lines, if you find this letter, please write my name once. Say it aloud. I want to believe that even if my body vanishes, my voice does not. She signed it simply. Mei Lin, former courtesan, lover of music, friend of Yunhua, daughter of a fisherman, human being. That letter now sits behind glass in a quiet museum, beneath soft lights. People walk by and read it. Some tear up, some say nothing, but nearly all of them speak her name before they go. Mei Lin, and in that whisper, she is alive again. Most of their belongings were never recorded. The inventory of a brothel, when listed by officials or auctioned off after closure, noted expensive items, lacquered furniture, painted fans, embroidered gowns. But what the women left behind wasn't always made of gold or silk. A carved hair comb with a missing tooth, a child's drawing of a crane in red ink, folded 100 times, a poem written on the back of a hand mirror, a bottle of perfume, nearly empty, still carrying a faint scent of jasmine and firewood. Some left journals, though most were hidden in floorboards or buried behind tiles. They contained simple things: what they ate, who they missed, the dreams they had after drinking too much plum wine. One journal described the same dream again and again. A field of sunflowers with no fences. There were gifts from clients too, though not all were welcomed. A pair of earrings from a man who beat her. A scarf stained with tears, still tied in a knot. A coin with a bite mark. A pair of shoes made from fish leather. Some women left nothing behind, nothing but stories passed from maid to maid, from brothel to brothel, whispered like wind. She could recite all of Li's poems in the dark. She died with a smile on her lips and her hand over her heart. She once kissed a soldier and said it was the first time she wasn't afraid. They didn't leave legacy the way emperors did. They didn't build towers or win wars. But in their small acts of survival, in their moments of laughter, in the crumbs of beauty they scattered across history, they left something behind, a trace, a thread, a spark that refused to go out. Even after centuries of silence, the songs remain. Some have been transformed into opera. Others drift through temples during festivals, their words mistaken for sacred hymns. But if you listen closely, you'll hear them. The courtesans' voices woven into the melody. They sang of lovers, yes, but also of hunger, of winter, of stars seen through wooden bars. I drink to forget, but remember more clearly. My sleeves are soaked with perfume and regret. Don't ask me who I was before this life. I no longer remember. These were not songs of pity. They were resistance in rhythm, testimony in tune. Young singers now study these pieces in music academies, not always knowing the lives behind them. But somewhere, in the breath before the note, something passes between the centuries, a quiet understanding that even in bondage, women created art, that even in sorrow, they found music, that even when no one listened, they still sang. And now we listen.